Charles Schwab surveyed Americans last year and asked them a simple question: how much do you need to be considered wealthy? The answer came back at $2.3 million in net worth. That's the number. That's where people drew the line. So here's the more interesting question: do you actually know what that looks like? Because the picture most of us carry around is still the old one. The flashy car, the designer watch, the house that's clearly too large for the number of people living in it. That version of wealth was always more about performance than reality. And in 2026, the gap between the performance and the reality has never been wider. This video is going to show you what wealth actually signals now. Not the loud version, the quiet version, the kind that takes some looking. Think about the person you know who seems to have it together financially. Maybe it's someone at work, maybe it's a neighbor. Chances are you built that impression from surface cues: the car they drive, the trips they mention, the neighborhood they live in. That's not an unreasonable way to read it. It's just increasingly wrong. Here's what the data actually shows. A man in his late 30s, earning $160,000 a year in a major US city, leased car, mortgaged home, $40,000 in actual net worth, looks the part completely. Meanwhile, the neighbor in the used Honda, working from home, rarely posting anything, crossed 2.1 million in assets last year. Same street, no visible difference. The signals that used to tell you who had money no longer do. Once you understand why, you start reading the room completely differently. My name is Alex, and if you've ever tried to figure out what separates the people who are genuinely building something from the ones who are just keeping up appearances, stay with me, because the markers are real and specific, and I'm going to walk through each one. It starts somewhere most people wouldn't expect. It starts with health. Most people, when they think about the foundations of wealth, go straight to the financial stuff: investments, income, assets. And that makes sense, but the wealthiest people in America right now are doing something that flips that instinct around. They're treating the body as the first asset, not a metaphor, an actual strategic priority that comes before the portfolio. Think about what that means for a second. Your ability to work, to think clearly, to make good decisions under pressure, to show up consistently over decades. All of it runs on one piece of hardware. And unlike a rental property or a brokerage account, you cannot diversify away from it. You only get one. This is why the longevity trend at the top of the wealth distribution is not really a wellness trend. It's an infrastructure decision. Like the people who have crossed that $2.3 million threshold are spending serious money on what gets called health optimization. Advanced blood panels run quarterly. Continuous glucose monitors to track metabolic response in real time. Sleep specialists. VO2 max testing. And increasingly, GLP-1 medications. Those are a class of powerful metabolic drugs originally developed for type 2 diabetes, now widely used to manage weight and reduce systemic inflammation. None of this is cheap. A comprehensive longevity protocol at a private clinic in the United States runs anywhere from $15,000 to $40,000 a year, and that's before you factor in the specialist consultations. Now you might be thinking that sounds extreme. And yeah, on the surface it does, but follow the incentive. If your net worth is $2 million and your ability to manage it, grow it, and make decisions about it depends on your cognitive function and physical energy, then spending $30,000 a year to protect that capacity is not indulgent. It's just math. The body is the first investment. Everything else is built on top of it. Here's where it gets genuinely surprising. The second signal in this section runs completely against a trend that held for over 150 years. For most of modern history, as income went up, family size went down. That was one of the most reliable patterns in all of economics. Wealthier households had fewer children. The assumption was simple. More money means more awareness of the costs, more investment per child, and smaller families by choice. Sociologists called it the demographic transition and treated it as basically settled. It is no longer settled. What researchers are now calling the Fertility J-Curve is showing up clearly in the data. At the very bottom of the income distribution, birth rates are relatively high. They fall through the middle class. And then, at the very top, households with significant assets and genuinely flexible resources, they start climbing again. The wealthiest Americans are having more children than the middle class. Not slightly more, meaningfully more. The mechanism behind this is worth understanding because it's not about values or lifestyle preferences. It's about resource slack. Family with $2.5 million in net worth and a paid-off home is not running the same internal calculus as a family with a $200,000 income and a $4,000 monthly mortgage. The first family has a genuine margin. They can absorb the cost, the complexity, and the time demand of a third or fourth child without it threatening their financial stability. The second family, even with a respectable income, often cannot, so they don't. When you have enough, a larger family stops being a financial risk and starts being something closer to an expression of abundance. That's the signal. The third piece of this foundation connects directly to the family question, but it's probably the one that generates the most pushback when people first hear it. For households with a net worth above $5 million, and 68% have one parent who is not working, one parent at home full-time. And the instinct, especially in a culture that treats dual income as both a financial necessity and a marker of ambition, is to read that as traditional or old-fashioned. It's neither. This is an optimization decision. Think about what a high net worth household actually looks like operationally. You have properties to manage, legal structures to monitor, school decisions that carry real long-term consequences, a social environment that requires active navigation, and a calendar that does not run itself. Outsourcing all of that to a rotating cast of nannies, property managers, tutors, and schedulers costs an enormous amount of money and still produces worse outcomes than someone who is fully embedded in the operation. One dedicated, capable person managing the household full-time is not a luxury. It's a system. The key distinction is that this is a choice made from strength, not necessity. Nobody is staying home because they have to. They're staying home because the return on that decision, measured in control and quality of outcome, exceeds what a second income would produce after taxes and costs. Control. That word keeps coming back. Over the body, over family size, over how the household runs. That's the actual pattern underneath all three of these signals. And it points directly to what the next layer of wealth looks like. Because once you have the personal foundation in place, the question becomes, how do you build the structure that holds it all together? That structure has a name most people have never heard. One, and it's growing faster than almost any other financial trend in the country right now. There is a structure that sits underneath serious wealth that almost nobody outside of it ever sees. It does not show up on social media. It does not get mentioned at dinner parties. Most financial advisors who work with ordinary high earners have never touched it. But for the people who have genuinely crossed into a different tier of financial life, it is the operating system that holds everything together. Before we get there, let's start with the piece that most people can actually visualize: property. The common assumption is that wealthy people own a lot of real estate, multiple homes, vacation properties, maybe something abroad. And at a certain level, that's true. The average household in the top wealth tier owns around 4 properties. But that number is not the interesting part. The interesting part is what's sitting underneath it. For a meaningful portion of truly wealthy households in America, the primary residence is owned outright. No mortgage, no lender, 100% equity. The house is simply theirs. Now sit with that for a moment, because in 2026, that is an almost incomprehensible position for most professionals to imagine. The average 30-year fixed mortgage rate has spent the last several years well above 6%. A median-priced home in a major U.S. metro now requires a monthly payment somewhere around $3,200, just in principal and interest, before taxes and insurance. For most households earning good incomes, the mortgage is the single largest monthly obligation they carry. It shapes every other financial decision they make. Owning a home outright means none of that. No payment, no lender who can call the loan, no exposure to rate changes. The largest single expense in most American households has been completely removed from the monthly equation. What that does to your financial flexibility is difficult to overstate. It does not just free up cash flow. It changes the entire risk profile of your life. That is what zero mortgage actually signals. Not that someone bought a nice house, that they reached a point where the bank is no longer a participant in their most important asset. Now here's where the structure gets more sophisticated. Most people manage their finances through a combination of a brokerage account, maybe a financial advisor they see once a year, and whatever their employer's benefits portal looks like. That works fine up to a point, but at a certain level of complexity, it stops being adequate. The decisions get bigger, the tax implications get more layered, the legal structures multiply, and the cost of getting any one of them wrong gets significant enough that a generalist advisor checking in quarterly is not going to cut it. This is where the family office comes in. A family office is essentially a private financial operation built specifically around one family's wealth, not a shared fund, not a managed account at a large institution. A dedicated team whose only client is you. They handle investment strategy, tax planning, estate structures, legal compliance, philanthropic vehicles, and often the operational logistics of managing multiple properties and business interests simultaneously. Think of it less like having a financial advisor and more like having a CFO, a general counsel, and a chief of staff rolled into a single operation that answers only to your family. Traditionally, family offices required somewhere in the range of $100 million in assets to justify the overhead. That threshold has been coming down. Single-family offices now operate at the $30 to $50 million level in many cases, and multifamily offices, where several wealthy households share the infrastructure and split the cost, have pushed that entry point even lower. Here's what tells you how significant this shift has become. The allocation of family office capital into private equity, meaning direct investment in private companies rather than public markets, has grown by over 500% in the past decade. That is not a minor trend. That is a structural repositioning of how serious wealth participates in the economy. These families are not buying index funds. They are buying ownership stakes in companies, infrastructure assets, and private credit instruments that are completely unavailable to anyone without the infrastructure to access and manage them. The gap between what wealthy families can invest in and what everyone else can invest in is widening, and the family office is a large part of why. Follow the incentive, and this makes complete sense. If you have the operational capacity to evaluate and hold private investments, you gain access to return profiles that public markets simply do not offer. You also gain something less obvious: control over the terms. In private deals, patient capital with no liquidity pressure negotiates differently than retail money chasing quarterly returns. The structure creates the advantage. And that connects directly to the broader philosophy that shows up consistently across this tier of wealth. The approach is not aggressive. It is not high risk. It is almost boring in its consistency. Own debt-free assets. Hold them for a long time. Let the compounding do the work. Avoid the pressure to perform quarter to quarter that pushes most investors into bad timing decisions. A family that owns a commercial property outright has held it for 18 years and has no mortgage payment to service can weather a downturn that would force a leveraged investor to sell at exactly the wrong moment. Patience is not just a virtue here, and it is a structural advantage that only becomes available once the debt is gone. Quietly. No urgency, no performance required. That word keeps appearing in a different form across everything in this tier. Control. Over the body, over the household, over the balance sheet, over the terms of investment. And once you have all of that in place, something else becomes possible. Something that is harder to quantify, but might be the most significant signal of all. The freedom to move through time on your own terms. Here's a question worth sitting with. If someone offered you a 50% raise tomorrow, but told you that in exchange, you would have no control over your schedule, no ability to take time off without approval, and your physical location would be fixed for the next 10 years, would you take it? Most people, if they answer honestly, would hesitate. Some would say no outright, because at a certain point, the limiting factor in a good life is not income, it is autonomy. And the truly wealthy figured that out a long time ago. This is the section where the signals stop being about assets and start being about freedom. Specifically, three kinds of it: freedom over your time, freedom over your legal and financial geography, and freedom over your physical environment. Each one builds on the last. And together, they describe something that a high income alone cannot buy. Start with time, because this is where the gap between looking wealthy and being wealthy shows up most clearly in daily life. There is a version of financial success that a lot of professionals are living right now that looks impressive from the outside and feels like a trap from the inside. The income is real. The title is real. The lifestyle markers are real. But the calendar belongs to someone else. Every hour is accounted for. Vacation requires planning months in advance and approval from someone above you. A family emergency means rearranging obligations that were never really yours to rearrange in the first place. The money is good. The control is close to zero. That is not wealth. That is a well-compensated constraint. And compare that to a household where the assets are generating enough income that the work becomes optional, or at least negotiable. Where pulling a kid out of school on a Wednesday for a 2-week trip to Portugal is a scheduling question, not a financial one. and not a permission question either, where the answer to most calendar conflicts is simply no, without an explanation required. The difference between those two lives is not always a dramatic difference in net worth. Sometimes it is a structural difference. Debt creates obligation. Obligation creates dependency. Dependency means your time belongs to whoever holds the note. Strip out the debt, build assets that generate income without requiring your daily presence, and the calendar starts to open up. That is the mechanism. It is not complicated, but it does not happen by accident. Now extend that logic outward. If time freedom matters, what about geographic freedom? This is where the passport strategy comes in, and it is more deliberate than most people realize. Wealthy Americans are not just collecting passports as a travel convenience. They are building optionality into their legal and financial identity, and they are doing it with a specific structure in mind. The first passport is the one you already have. It covers your primary life, where you live, where your family is, where your social infrastructure is rooted. That one is not going anywhere. The second passport is a tax and legal positioning tool. Several countries offer residency or citizenship programs that come with significantly more favorable treatment of investment income, capital gains, and estate transfers. Portugal, Malta, Panama, and the UAE have all been popular in this category at various points in the last decade. Establishing legal residency in one of these jurisdictions does not necessarily mean moving there. It means creating a legal footprint that changes which rules apply to your assets. The people doing this are not avoiding anything illegally. They are making a deliberate choice about which legal environment their wealth operates within. The third passport is different in kind from the other two. It is not about taxes or lifestyle. It is a contingency, a backup plan for a scenario nobody wants to think about, but serious wealth managers increasingly build into long-term planning. Political instability, currency collapse, a legal or regulatory environment that shifts in ways that threaten asset security. Having a third citizenship from a stable, unrelated jurisdiction means that no single government's decisions can fully determine your options. It is the geopolitical equivalent of not keeping all your money in one bank. 3 passports, 3 different jobs. One of them for your life, one for your money, and one for your security. The third dimension of freedom is the one that sounds the most extravagant until you understand the logic behind it. The ability to simply change your physical coordinates when the environment stops working for you. Not just vacation, actual relocation. If the air quality in your city deteriorates badly enough to affect your health, if the political climate in your state shifts in a way that directly impacts your family's education or safety, if the tax environment changes so significantly that it restructures your financial position overnight, the response is not to lobby or wait or adapt. The response is to move. This sounds extreme until you realize that the infrastructure we discussed in the last section makes it entirely practical. If you have no mortgage tying you to a specific property, if your income is not dependent on physically showing up somewhere, and if your financial operations are managed by a team that can function regardless of your zip code, then geography becomes a variable rather than a fixed constraint. You are not stuck anywhere. Control over where you are. Control over when you move. Control over which rules govern your financial life. That theme has run through every section of this video, and it goes deeper than most people expect. Because the most significant form of control that wealth produces is not external at all. It is psychological, and it changes how you experience almost everything. There is a behavioral pattern that shows up consistently in people who are under financial pressure, and most of them have no idea they are doing it. They talk faster. They fill silence. They move with a kind of low-level urgency that never fully turns off. They are always slightly in catch-up mode, always angling toward the next thing, always performing competence and momentum because stopping feels dangerous. It is not a personality type. It is a response to scarcity. And once you know what you are looking at, you start seeing it everywhere. The people who have genuinely crossed into a different financial reality tend to move differently, quieter, less reactive. There is a stillness to how they operate that can read as arrogance if you misread it. But it is not arrogance. It is the absence of pressure. They are not trying to catch up because they are not behind. They are not performing confidence because they do not need the room to believe anything about them. The calendar is theirs. The decisions are theirs. And that changes everything about how a person carries themselves through the world. Researchers and behavioral economists have a name for the cognitive tax that financial stress creates. When your mental bandwidth is consistently consumed by near term money pressure, the capacity available for long term thinking, creative problem solving, and calm decision making shrinks measurably. One study out of Princeton and Harvard put a number on it. The cognitive drain of financial scarcity is equivalent to losing roughly 13 IQ points. That is not a small effect. That is the difference between your best thinking and significantly compromised thinking, applied to every financial decision you make at exactly the moment when those decisions matter most. Wealth does not make people smarter, but removing the scarcity pressure frees up the cognitive capacity that was already there. That is the mechanism, and it compounds over time in ways that are hard to overstate. Now, here is the reframe that this whole section is really building toward. There is a quote that captures it precisely. Your worries become strategic, not survival. Read that slowly, because it is doing more work than it appears to. It does not mean the wealthy have no problems. They do. It does not mean life at that level is frictionless or easy. It is not. What it means is that the category of problem changes entirely. The survival layer, which for most households means things like, will this unexpected expense break the monthly budget? What happens if one of us loses income? How do we handle this medical bill without going backward? That layer is gone. Not managed. Gone. What replaces it are problems of a completely different character. How do we structure the estate to minimize friction for the next generation? Which philanthropic vehicle makes the most sense for the goals we actually have? How do we evaluate this private investment opportunity against our existing allocation? These are real problems. They require genuine thought and expertise, but they are optional in a way that survival problems are not. You can take your time with them. You can bring in specialists. You can get them wrong once and recover. Now think about what that shift does to a person's daily experience. The background anxiety that most professionals carry, the low hum of financial uncertainty that never fully goes away, simply is not there, and its absence creates space for a quality of attention and presence that money cannot directly purchase, but financial security quietly enables. There is a line that captures this as well as anything. At this level, you genuinely would not trade your problems for anyone else's, not because your life is perfect, but because the problems you have are interesting, optional, and solvable, and that is a rare thing. The final signal in this section is the one that ties everything together. Optimism, not the motivational poster version, not the disposition of someone who has decided to think positive thoughts and see the bright side. And this is something more structural and more durable than that. This is optimism as a direct consequence of ownership. When you own assets that are embedded in the growth of the economy, your financial position improves as the economy improves. A rising market is not something you watch from the outside, hoping it helps you. It directly, mechanically increases your net worth. You own the upside, and owning the upside creates a very rational, very grounded reason to believe that tomorrow is likely to be better than today, not because of faith or personality, because of math. This is why wealthy people tend to be long-term thinkers, almost by default. The structure of their financial life rewards patience and punishes panic. Every down cycle in history has been followed by a recovery. And if you own assets across that cycle, rather than being forced to sell into the bottom because you need the liquidity, you capture the full return. The optimism is not naive. It is underwritten by ownership. And when you pull back and look at everything this video has covered, that is really what the through line is. Health as infrastructure. Family as an expression of resource abundance, a debt-free balance sheet, a professional operation managing the complexity, time that belongs to you, geography as a variable, problems that are strategic rather than urgent, and a structural reason to believe the future is working in your favor. That is what modern wealth actually looks like. Not louder, quieter, more control, and built to last. Here is what this all comes down to. The definition of wealthy has quietly shifted, and most people are still using the old one. The car, the watch, the visible spending, those were never really the signals. They were the performance of wealth, not the thing itself. What the real signals have in common is control. Control over the body that has to last you another 40 years. Control over a household structure that is built for complexity, not just income. Control over a balance sheet with no lender sitting inside it. Control over a calendar that answers to you. Control over which legal environment your assets live in. And underneath all of it, control over the quality of your problems. The question worth sitting with is not how much someone earns. It is how much of their life they actually own. Because here is what tends to follow from that. Once you start reading the room this way, the people who seem quietly settled start to look very different from the people who are simply spending at the edge of their income. The gap between those two groups is structural, and the structure is learnable, which raises one more question worth exploring. How does that structure actually get built from the beginning?